Thank you very much for making this part of your Sunday, and I'd like to thank Marvin and the Jewish Museum of Maryland, not only for having me, but for also doing this wonderful exhibit, Scrapyard. If you have time after the talk, I encourage you to see it. It's quite lovely. My talk today is based on the book Cash for Your Trash, Scrap Recycling in America, and I'll cover a few of the key historical developments featured in that book over the next half hour. I won't elaborate too much because if you want elaboration again, that wonderful exhibit is right there behind us. Before I get into my talk, I have a question. Show of hands, who here knows if there is a scrap dealer or worker somewhere in your family's history? Yeah, there's a segment of us here, aren't there? This is not unusual. For when I was first getting into this as a graduate student back in the 20th century, I was speaking with my dissertation advisor, who also happens to be Jewish, and we were talking about our own family histories, and it turned out we both had scrap dealers in our family tree. And I talked to many other Jewish historians, and it turns out almost all of us had a scrap dealer. Some are quite famous. Actually, my friend Lisa Bem is a member of the Padnos family of Western Michigan, who are covered in the Scrapyard exhibit. My great-grandfather Abraham Zimring is not in the exhibit, but scrap is the reason he came to the United States, and I am an American. In 1904, he was desperately trying to leave Vienna. A contact who had been in the community had emigrated to Waterloo, Iowa, and opened a scrapyard. The contact sent Abraham boat and train fare on the condition that Abraham come and go from farm to farm collecting broken farm equipment and kitchenware to bring back to the scrapyard. And that is how his son, my grandfather Maury Zimring, grew up with an accent I can only describe as Yiddish Jimmy Stewart. Now, if you tour the exhibit here, you'll see that stories like Abraham Zimring's are common in the American Jewish experience. Now, Abraham Zimring was not in the industry long, nor was he especially successful. But his experience collecting old iron in rural Iowa shaped my family's history and provided my entry into investigating how Americans have recycled and who exactly was doing the work of recycling. Now, repurposing old material and new manufactured goods has a very long history. The book of Isaiah's reference to beating swords into plowshares provides evidence of how useful, malleable, and sturdy metals could be over and over in use. The context for pre-industrial recycling was different than what we understand today. The first sentence of this book is Paul Revere recycled. Now, Revere did so not because he was worried about the environmental damage of mass garbage disposal, but because British economic policy barred the colonies from producing new iron goods from virgin ore. Recycling emerged not as a reaction to the ills of consumption, but as an opportunity to maximize profit in production. Recycling is an economic activity. Collecting and melting down scrap allowed for the production of metal goods, including the horseshoes that allowed Revere to make his famous ride warning that the British were coming. Now, most scrap metal use and collection was very, very local and small scale in the colonial period. In the early Republic, manufacturing intensified and provided more demand for salvaged materials. Initially, the widely sought materials were cotton and linen rags that could be used in paper manufacture. By 1820, a transatlantic trade in rags emerged as cloth fibers produced satisfactory grades of paper. And in the Scrapyard exhibit, you'll see there's one case study of Francis Bannerman and Sons. Bannerman is one of the scrap dealers in the United States who's actually exporting materials to Scotland and England as demand for the rags increases over there. In the United States, mills employed indigent people, including widows and orphans, to collect rags that could be bleached and processed into paper. This work was subsistence-based. Handling rags in the early 19th century was work associated with poverty. This cartoon from Barron's magazine in the 1870s captioned "In the Rag Trade," and you see this woman down on her luck with a cart and a couple of dogs. This is a popular conception of the trade as poor women scavenging for subsistence. That construction of the waste trade worker never goes away completely, but the economic context for salvage changes during and after the United States Civil War. In the late 19th century, the United States becomes what historian Tom Misa has called a nation of steel. Steel was the building block upon which skyscrapers were constructed, ships were built, railroads could crisscross the continent, and any manner of tools and machines were fashioned, including the farm machinery that Abraham Zimring would collect in Iowa. Many of the famous tycoons of American history involved themselves in the steel trade. Andrew Carnegie's ascent from Scottish orphan to railroad inventory clerk to steel tycoon is only the most famous example of what kind of wealth could be amassed through steel. Railroads, steel mills, and later automobile manufacturers sought old metal in their manufacture. Why did they do this? Old metal that might be coming from building sites, from old ships, from broken equipment, was much cheaper to acquire than mining virgin ore. Andrew Carnegie is a good example of this. As Carnegie Steel is growing in size, he buys large swaths of land in northern Minnesota to get iron ore out of the Gogebic Range, and he has to get that carted then down to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to smelt into steel. He had already amassed a fair amount of wealth, so he could afford to buy land up in Minnesota, but smaller steel mills often would employ scrap metal. There were some limitations with doing this in the 19th century. A lot of steel mills and iron mills would actually brag, "We don't use any scrap, so you don't have to worry about the inferior grade of steel that you might get from that old, dirty metal." That said, advances in steel production, especially the open hearth process, allowed production of durable alloys from old iron without fear of contamination from dirt, rust, or other impurities. If a mill could produce strong new steel using only scrap, it would save even more money. By the turn of the 20th century, the open hearth process is in fairly widespread use. In 1901, it becomes even more so when U.S. Steel opens its gigantic steelworks in Gary, Indiana. And with the capacity to use more scrap, demand for ferrous scrap goes up. By this time, ferrous scrap had become the dominant secondary material traded in Europe and North America. Businesses to handle these materials grew in size and number, with some generating substantial profits. No longer simply associated with poverty, scrap recycling became an industry associated with the vast increase in manufacturing. One part of the evolution of this industry is the demographics of the industry change in several ways. The one that I want to do right now, because I have this slide, is the sexual division of labor in the scrap industry, if you look at it from the U.S. Census of Population, starts to skew more male. You still have some women working scavenging, and you certainly have a lot of women working doing the books in family-owned businesses, but you get more and more men in the industry. That's one of the dimensions going on here. Another one, though, is the companies that handle the goods collected from municipal recycling systems are based in the scrap companies founded in the late 19th century. This work has a complex history. Although large companies like Carnegie Steel and the Erie Railroad trained engineers to use ferrous scrap in their operations, they did not actually do what I call the dirty work of collecting the materials themselves. This is often unpleasant work. Rather, they purchased supplies from independent businesses that scavenged from construction and demolition sites, shipbreaking operations, and door-to-door collections of discarded iron and steel products ranging from pots and pans to old tractors and, by World War I, automobiles. A loose network of scavengers, junkyard owners, and scrap brokers collected materials that ultimately found their ways into the facilities of a small number of large manufacturing companies, including U.S. Steel, Pennsylvania Railroad, and eventually Ford and General Motors. Thus, a large technological system of material reclamation involved an informal network of thousands of people feeding scrap to a small number of large customers. So in this way, scrap is almost the inverse of what most industries are, where you have a few businesses selling to thousands and thousands of customers. Ultimately here, there are a very small number of ultimate customers, but thousands and thousands of suppliers. There are a number of stories of individual achievements in the exhibit. There's one I'd love to point out, though, because this is one of my favorite stories. Sigmund Dringer exemplified the opportunities immigrants found in the scrap industry. Dringer was a Jewish immigrant from Austria who migrated in 1867 to New Jersey at the age of 30. Within 10 years of entering the country, he rose from driving a wagon for a Newark junk man for $10 a week to establishing his own yard in Paterson. According to the New York Times in 1877, Dringer had established a business generating more than $100,000 a year, despite the fact that he could neither read nor write in English. Sigmund Dringer's was an unusually successful story, but the low cost of entering the trade invited many immigrants to start businesses. Most of these were not in rural areas like Waterloo, Iowa, but in the nation's largest cities. Now, in the book, I use city directory data, basically the antecedents of the Yellow Pages, to chart the growth of the industry in these cities. And just to give you a sample, here are the figures from Philadelphia over, I'm going the wrong way, that's what's going on here, over a period of 60 years. So before the Civil War, there are not many junk, rag, or scrap firms. Most of them are rag firms. As you can see, during and after the Civil War, it goes up. And as you get into the 20th century, it goes up even more with a major shift between 1910 and 1921. In the book, I go into slightly more detail about the composition of these businesses. Most of the firms after 1880 are ferrous scrap businesses in Philadelphia. That said, the names for the businesses vary wildly. The word junk is used often during this period, less so afterwards for reasons we might talk about in the Q&A. This pattern of growth is repeated in New York City, Detroit, Chicago, Boston, as the ferrous scrap industry truly becomes a mature industry. By 1917, business journalist George Manlove notes that the scrap iron industry was doing $1 billion in annual trade. It is not a coincidence that this is happening as World War I is ramping up. Charting the scale of the industry is one of the features of the book, but I also wanted to investigate why people like my great-grandfather decided to do this work. Why were so many Jewish immigrants involved in the scrap trade? One reason is opportunity. With demand for scrap materials growing, one could start a business with little to spend money on. You could have a sack on your back to collect the materials. The key thing to start a business in the period between the Civil War and World War I isn't so much investing in equipment, but developing the skill to identify discarded materials that someone would want to buy, collecting them, and then finding that person or business to actually buy them from you. And that way, scrap was a real opportunity for the small business owner. For observant Jews who wished to stop work before nightfall on a Friday, scrap offered a chance to own one's own business and not risk discrimination by an unsympathetic supervisor. It is not the only such business, a particularly famous sector of the economy where a lot of immigrant Jews are working at this time are also in the grocery trade. But scrap is providing new opportunities for wealth at this time, and so you get thousands and thousands of first and second generation Jewish immigrants working in it. I get into this in great detail in the book. And what I'd like to do is, since I've already started using some quantitative evidence in this discussion, I want to point out one of the other quantitative conclusions I developed in this book, which is there are stories in the scrap industry of this being a Jewish trade. Most of the famous figures in it are Jewish. But I wanted to assess how much of this is folklore and how much of this is actually rooted in the representative experiences of the industry. Observations in the late 19th century is that Southern and Eastern Europeans, not just Jews but also Poles and Italians, are more likely to handle waste. The Streets and Sanitation Commissioner in New York City, George Waring, opined in 1895 that these immigrants were, quote, racially suited, unquote, to scavenge. They had a particular talent for doing so. He has this article in The Atlantic where he goes on about how these people are perfect for handling wastes. He linked waste to ethnicity rather than economic status. In the U.S. Census of Population, we can see the demographics of the industry as it grows. The number of people whose occupation is either junk worker, rag dealer, or scrap dealer grows significantly between 1880 and 1920. We can also connect these occupations to the places of birth for these people, which is fantastic. For 1880 and 1920, most of these workers are foreign-born, and it's very easy to tell how many Italian immigrants are in the trade. But Italian is not too difficult to do in the census because there's this place of birth called Italy. Where are Jews born? We're the diaspora. Yes, that's a big, tricky problem. Place of birth has a limited utility in assessing Jewish participation in the trade. This could involve people from Germany, could involve people from Austria, Poland, Russia, many, many places. A great question, if we were going to ask how many Jews are involved in the trade, is what religion are you? But the U.S. Census of Population does not ask individuals what religion they are. First Amendment protections. That said, as the historian Nancy Cotts Watkins argued in 1991, there is a more precise way of identifying Jews in the U.S. Census. The census did not ask about religion, but they did ask individuals what language they spoke and what languages their mothers and fathers spoke. And Watkins argues that if someone lists on the census that their native tongue or their parents' native tongue is Yiddish, Hebrew, or Jewish, that's a reasonably good measurement for Jewish identity. Of course, this is 1880, 1920. Today, that might be trickier because I speak a very little amount of Yiddish. I can't possibly say native tongue, and neither can my parents. So as we have become more Americanized, that could be more difficult. But in 1920, Yiddish, Hebrew, or Jewish as either yours or your parents' native tongue is a reasonably good proxy for Jewish identity. So what I did is I tested where I compared occupation junk worker to native tongue in the integrated public use microdata sample of the 1920 census population. And with this, I found that people whose native tongue was Yiddish, Hebrew, or Jewish in 1920 was under 10% of the American population. But amongst the junk workers, a different number emerges. That giant orange part of the pie chart, that's the Yiddish Jewish native tongue answer for the question in 1920. 48% of all junk and scrap workers listed this language as native tongue for themselves or one parent. 22% listed English or no language at all. 13% listed Russian. The most conservative estimate from these statistics is half of all scrap workers had Jewish ancestry. Liberal indications could, if you involve the other Eastern European languages and the no language listed at all, that it would be very close to Fortune magazine's 1936 assertion that the scrap metal industry was 90% Jewish. As the industry matured, scrap firms offered real opportunities for advancement, literal rags to riches stories for the families of the founders who served the growth of American industrial production. And again, in the exhibit, one of the more famous examples is Louis Meyer, the Hollywood producer who starts in the scrap industry. My own family actually have a slightly less successful version of that story. After Abraham Zimring fails in scrap and fails in liquor and fails in tobacco, his sons move the family to LA and they become a Hollywood screenwriter and a Hollywood agent, and they bring Abraham along so that he's not in poverty. There are many opportunities to grow in wealth, and oftentimes the second generation in the scrap industry might involve kids who then go to business school or to law school to then run the firm, and the firms mature and grow over the course of the 20th century. But if I leave it there, I'm skipping over some really important stuff, because those firms that grew not only had to deal with the workplace hazards of dealing with scrap, they had to deal with a lot of stigma and a lot of questioning them for being workers in this dirty and dangerous business, and also being immigrants working in this. Anti-Semitic caricatures of scrap dealers are rampant in the late 19th and early 20th century. The reason I can tell you about Sigmund Dringer's story in 1877, that the New York Times is writing about him, is that the Erie Railroad sued Dringer over a business dispute where they're claiming that this illiterate scrap dealer has swindled the Erie Railroad by taking a lot of their old material and selling it at a tremendous profit. He wins the suit, by the way. Dringer's story is huge, but it's not unique. In a 1914 article in the trade magazine Metal Industry, W.H. Parry, the superintendent of the National Meter Company in Brooklyn, warned customers, quote, to be on the constant lookout, or some pretty raw deals will be slipped over on them that will prove at least why they prefer to be called scrap dealers. If there is any one trick that these dealers do not know of, I have yet to hear of it. The schemes Perry described included one involving a copper dealer who froze water inside copper casks he was to sell in order to inflate their weight. Another story involved a 150-pound St. Bernard. Quote, this animal is so well trained that if his boss is selling materials, he just loves to be weighed in with the load, unquote. Actually, this is a Maryland story. Principio foundry owner Nelson Whitaker, writing to his attorney in 1895 regarding a firm he felt was attempting to defraud his company, emphasized that they must be cautious in handling the situation as he was, quote, dealing with a firm composed entirely of Jews. By the way, that letter is found in the Maryland Historical Society's collection, because the Principio Foundry was here in Baltimore. The Chicago Juvenile Protective Association, one of many progressive efforts to improve the welfare of urban children, conducted an investigation after World War I to assess the impact of the city's junk dealers on urban children. The association described junk dealers as, quote, low on the scale of ethics and intelligence and a moral menace to minors, fraught with grave dangers to health and physical well-being. Also in Chicago, Jane Addams, famous for Hull House Settlement, talked about scrap dealers as corrupting children, that she said that they would encourage children to go break into buildings, take out the plumbing, and give them to the scrap dealers, and then with the money they got from the scrap dealers, they would go buy beer. This exhibit discusses some of the stigma as well as what the industry did in response. Scrap dealers responded to this as well as charges of war profiteering by forming trade associations. The first major one is the National Association of Waste Material Dealers, shortly after the turn of the 20th century, and then about 20 years later, the Institute of Scrap Iron and Steel. Neither of these exist in the same form today, but they are both forerunners of today's Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries, headquartered in Washington, D.C. So organized, the trade associations lobbied federal, state, and local legislatures and promoted the industry as vital agents of conservation and themselves not as shifty foreigners, but as hardworking, patriotic Americans doing the vital work of providing affordable materials for General Motors, for the railroads, and yes, for the war effort. This is largely successful. Now, to be a member of one of the trade associations, you have to pass a test to be in it. And part of that is there are ethics codes. And so one of the reasons why the trade associations work to uphold the image of scrap dealers is that if you are a member of the Institute of Scrap Iron and Steel, that means you are not committing fraud on anyone. If you are caught committing fraud, you are expelled from the trade association. And with that, the businesses grow over the course of the 20th century. I don't have time to get into some of the amazing growth that takes place during and after World War II, other than to say that one firm, Luria Brothers of Reading, Pennsylvania, becomes so large, the Federal Trade Commission opens an investigation into whether or not they are cornering the ferrous scrap market. Many businesses ultimately decide to get out of the trade in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, in part because holding companies realize, oh, there's some money to be made here, and two, the context for doing business is changing in the late 20th century. In 1905, you could become a scrap dealer with a sack on your back and maybe a push cart. 1970, it's a little more difficult because the processing technology, again, details of which are more in the exhibit, becomes more expensive to invest in. In particular, by the 1970s, scrapyards that can afford to buy the equipment to turn automobiles into the component scraps in a matter of minutes have a tremendous advantage over their competitors. But an automobile shredder could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So you can't simply come off the boat and suddenly open a scrapyard that could become a multi-million-dollar concern in 1972. Now, there's some irony of what I've just said, because if you did have a scrapyard that operated as automobile shredder in the 1970s, by the 1990s, you'd be regulated as a toxic polluter because all the nasty things that we put in automobiles were being turned into the most adorable name for toxic waste I have ever heard. The official name for the stuff out of shredders is automobile shredder residue, but what the industry calls it is fluff. Fluff sounds adorable. It's like the lint in your dryer, except if the lint in your dryer included lead, acid from batteries, asbestos from brake lines, and other toxic materials. This is one of the many complications the scrap industry has as the United States becomes concerned with environmental protections. The irony with the automobile shredder is abandoned automobiles and automobiles piling high in automobile graveyards were seen as a visual blight on the landscape in the 1950s and 60s, and the shredder was seen as a way of solving that problem. By the 1990s, the problems with toxic waste indicate that the shredder is seen more as a problem for the environment rather than an opportunity. That's one of the downsides of the modern environmental era's relationship with scrapyards. But there are also opportunities. I mean, the industry's trade association is now uses the word recycling in its title. Once recycling becomes associated with being a moral environmentalist, the scrap industry rebrands itself. And Charles Lipset, who is one of the great journalists in the history of the industry, his last book is called 100 Years of Recycling History. The scrap industry calls themselves the original recyclers, whose decades of experience putting discarded material back into production is crucial to the success of recycling collection programs. In the last chapter of my book, I talk about some of the adventures New York City has had with recycling. New York City is the largest scrap recycling trading site really from the beginning of the industry in the 19th century. And in the late 20th century, the city initiates a curbside collection program. You may or may not be familiar with why the city did that. There was a Long Island barge called the Mobro, which had a lot of junk on it in 1987, and it went out to sea because it was going to go to a port further down the Atlantic coast to deposit the wastes from New York. Only it never had found the approval to dump the waste anywhere. So over the course of several weeks, the tabloids in New York City are talking about the shame of New York as this barge goes from port to port saying, will you take our junk? And no one is taking it, and ultimately comes back to Long Island. As a result of that, within a couple of years, New York City starts a curbside collection program for cans, bottles, newspapers, and other detritus. And they contract with the world's largest waste management company called Waste Management. They've got the green and yellow trucks to pick up that recycling for only about $50 million a year of taxpayer money. Turns out there are a number of problems with this, and in 2002, when Mike Bloomberg becomes mayor, he cancels the contract saying this isn't working, and there's huge outrage in New York City as parents are saying that their kids are coming back from second grade going, Mommy, why don't we care about the earth? We can't recycle anymore, because the recycling industry is really good at teaching kids in as early as preschool that recycling is something we do for the environment. And what happens is the city eventually gets an offer from Hugo Noy, which, because of a number of mergers, is the result of one of the largest scrap companies of the 1920s and 30s. This is one of the descendants of it. Said, we aren't going to charge you $50 million a year for all of your scrap. How about this? We'll pay you the market rate for the metals that you're collecting, and we'll also take the glass and plastic because of that. And so because they were dealing not with a garbage company that was simply looking at the recyclables as a burden, but as a business that understood through decades of work that recycling is a commodities industry, New York City not only saved money, but actually made some money off of its recycling in the 21st century. That 21st century opportunity is not possible without understanding the 19th and 20th century history, and it starts off with Paul Revere being a recycler back in the colonial period. Much more goes on in between. That's the subject of this book. My alarm has gone off telling me I should stop talking and ask questions, and thank you very much for listening. And we have about 15, 20 minutes if people would like to. Yes?
The company that bailed out New York City, was it Jewish?
Yes, it was. And in fact, most of these companies, the big companies, are Jewish.
Racially, that one slide at the beginning, you said these people from Southern and Eastern Europe were racially qualified?
Yeah, well, I didn't say, George Waring did. I'm quoting him. I kind of disagree with that, yes.
Saying the blacks were racially suited to pick cotton, or the Polish and Lithuanian were racially suited to do work in the coal mines? I'm being funny here.
No. And the question is, George Waring's quote on immigrants being racially suited to this, is this the equivalent of African Americans being racially suited to pick cotton? This is exactly the kind of construction that's going on here. And this is the 1890s when eugenics is really, really in vogue in popular culture as well as in academia. I have another book called Clean and White, A History of Environmental Racism in the United States, where I was so struck by this and a number of other things I found when researching this. These kinds of attitudes are not unique at all to George Waring at this time. Yeah.
To piggyback on that, I'm thinking that either the Jewish people were smart enough to see an opportunity and/or they were so prejudiced against that they couldn't go into other businesses and things. Maybe that's why they got into this.
And the follow-up is Jews were restricted from other businesses due to prejudices, and this is absolutely true. But this is not the only industry that Jews were, again, if you look at the other exhibit here in Baltimore, tailoring, clothing is a huge opportunity. As I mentioned, groceries are a big opportunity. What's interesting about scrap at this point is that the volume of demand is going up so quickly in the 1890s through the 1920s that this provides some real opportunities as well as some real dangers. This is a very hazardous business to be in. You could have lead poisoning, you could get puncture wounds, you could get tetanus, but if you were willing to do it, there could be some real opportunities here.
So the scrap is sent right to the steel mills, or is it processed first before it goes to the steel mills?
The question is the scrap going straight to the steel mills or is it processed first? The answer is it really depends. If it's in New York City, it's probably getting processed in Jersey City and then it goes to like Pennsylvania or Indiana. If it's in Chicago, it might be going straight to the mills because there's great railroad access straight from Chicago to Gary, Indiana. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about the scrap and recycling industry in the next 20 years?
Oh, between now and the next... Okay, let's see. How much time do we have on this? So the scrap material industry right now is in a real interesting situation because most of my talk has been about ferrous metal, and ferrous metal always has and always will have some real demand in this industry. But this is not the only material we throw out. Other metals are highly coveted, and I have a book just about aluminum that talks about some of the fascinating ways that we love to use aluminum. But if you have a car that was built in the last 20 years, have you ever looked to see how many different types of materials are in that automobile? There's so many, and so many of them are plastics. Plastics are a real problem for the industry, both in terms of the plastic water bottles and beverage containers that we use, and also plastics integrated into other materials. What are plastics made out of? Petroleum. And plastics truly are a plural. There are many, many different types of plastics out there, and it's very difficult to separate them without worries of contamination. Some plastics are fairly easy to recycle, others are very difficult to recycle. And actually, one of the last things in the scrapyard exhibit talks about is that the market for our wastes, this is a global industry, but over the last couple of years, the People's Republic of China has stopped importing a lot of our waste, particularly plastics and paper stock. In part, the paper stock is contaminated with plastics. So this has led to a real crisis. What are we going to do with all of this disposable material that we have been sending overseas? Well, we could process it here, but there's not that much demand for plastic relative to metals. One reason is the contamination issues I just mentioned, but the other is it's really cheap to make plastic from petroleum, so why would you recycle it? You don't have to worry about getting ore from a mine in Minnesota and bringing it to Pennsylvania. You can just, and in fact, the American petroleum industry is focusing more on making plastics now as the shift on energy sources is going forward. So one of the big crises for the industry is what are we going to do with all this material? And one of the things ISRI, the Institute for Scrap Recycling Industries, is doing actually relates to a lot of my work as an educator. So my current job is I'm a professor of sustainability studies at an art and design school in New York. And the reason I'm there is that my students are industrial designers, fashion designers, the makers of the future. And what I try to do with them is to really think about their work and their designs to reduce the amount of waste and reduce the amount of contamination from unwanted materials in their new goods and systems. Whether or not this will lead to major changes in manufacturing so that when you're taking a car apart, you don't have lots of plastics as well as toxic materials in the car, those will be issues that will affect the scrap industry in the year 2040 or 2050. Did that answer your question? Because I could go on for a while on this. But those are the real concerns that we're worried about right now. Any other questions? If not, thank you so much for coming, and if you have some time, I urge you to go into the exhibit to see more about this wonderful industry's history.